In Denver's suburbs, a 67-year-old widow was about to face her greatest fear. What started as a family reunion took a shocking turn when whispered conversations revealed her decades-old secret was unraveling. Danica Samson wasn't your typical grandmother. For 40 years, she had carried the devastating truth about her late husband's hidden past, known for protecting her family at any cost. When she encountered her son's investigation and her granddaughter's genealogy research, she had no idea she was walking into a battle between love and truth that would shatter everything she'd sacrificed to protect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Danica Samson's hands trembled slightly as she turned off the ignition in Mike's driveway, the familiar weight of her grief settling across her shoulders like a heavy shawl. 6 months. 6 months since Bob's funeral, since the last time she'd faced this sprawling suburban Denver home filled with 3 generations of Samsons. The house looked the same. Red brick facade, perfectly manicured lawn, Jennifer's flower beds bursting with late summer blooms. But everything felt different now. Through the large picture window, she could see figures moving about, setting up tables, arranging chairs. The annual reunion. 43 years of these gatherings. And Bob had loved everyone. He'd been the storyteller, the one who kept the family's history alive with his animated tales of their early years together, his adventures before they met, the dreams they'd built side by side. Now she was the keeper of those stories, all of them, even the ones that could destroy everything. "You can do this," she murmured to herself, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. Gray hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, lipstick applied with the precision of someone who'd been teaching teenagers for 30 years. The face that looked back at her seemed older than her 67 years, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and careful vigilance. She grabbed her purse and the pan of brownies from the passenger seat, Bob's recipe, though she'd never tell the family that particular detail, and made her way to the front door. Before she could knock, it swung open to reveal Jennifer's warm smile, though Danica's trained eye caught the slight tension around her daughter-in-law's eyes. "Danica!" Jennifer pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of the brownies. "We're so glad you're here. Everyone's been asking about you." "Have they?" The question slipped out before Danica could stop it, carrying more weight than a simple pleasantry should bear. Jennifer's smile flickered. "Of course. You know how much everyone loves you." As they entered the foyer, the familiar cacophony of family reunion voices washed over them. Children's laughter from the backyard, adult conversations layering over each other, the clatter of dishes being arranged in the kitchen. But something felt off-kilter, like a symphony played in a slightly wrong key. "Grandma Danica!" Tyler appeared at her elbow, his artistic eye immediately taking in her carefully composed expression. At 19, he possessed an emotional radar that made him both a joy and a concern. "You look tired. Are you sleeping okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." She touched his cheek, noting how his question felt more like an assessment than casual concern. "Just adjusting to everything." Mike emerged from the kitchen carrying a serving tray, his insurance adjuster's methodical nature evident in how he'd arranged the plates in perfect rows. When he saw his mother, his step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Mom." His greeting was warm but stilted, like he was reading from a script he'd forgotten half the lines to. "Good drive over?" "Traffic wasn't bad." She studied his face, looking for the easy affection that had always characterized their relationship. Instead, she found something that made her stomach clench, the same expression he wore when reviewing claim files that didn't quite add up. "Mike is everything." "Emma?" Jennifer called out, cutting through the moment. "Your grandmother's here." Emma Samson Walker bounded down the stairs with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent the last month diving deep into ancestry websites. Her laptop was tucked under one arm, and her eyes held the bright intensity of a journalist who'd caught scent of a story. "Grandma! Perfect timing. I was just showing the cousins some of the family tree research I've been doing." Emma's voice carried an undercurrent of excitement, mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps. "There are some really interesting things I've discovered about our family history." Danica's blood chilled. Oh? Yeah, it's fascinating, though there are some gaps in the records that I'm trying to figure out. Emma's journalistic instincts were clearly at work, her tone carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was fishing for information, especially around Grandpa Bob's early years. Your grandfather lived through different times, Danica said carefully. Record-keeping wasn't what it is now. Mike set down his tray with unnecessary force. That's what I keep telling everyone. Dad's generation didn't document everything the way we do. But his tone suggested he'd been having this conversation frequently, and not everyone was buying his explanation. The afternoon unfolded with the familiar rhythms of family gathering, stories shared, photos passed around, children running between the adults. But Danica felt like she was watching it all through glass, hyper-aware of every pause in conversation when she approached, every meaningful glance exchanged between family members. She helped Jennifer in the kitchen, arranging vegetables on a platter while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations flowing around her. Sarah hadn't arrived yet from California, but her impending presence hung in the air like an approaching storm. Sarah, who'd always asked the uncomfortable questions, who'd never quite bought into the family mythology the way the others had. Danica, could you check if we have enough ice? Jennifer asked, though her tone suggested the request was more about giving her mother-in-law a moment to collect herself than about actual ice supplies. In the garage, Danica stood among the familiar suburban detritus, lawn equipment, holiday decorations, Mike's meticulously organized tools, and tried to steady her breathing. This was her family. These people loved her. But love and truth weren't always compatible, and she'd learned that lesson 40 years ago when Bob had confessed his secret through tears and desperate whispers. She was reaching for the bag of ice when she heard Mike's voice through the thin garage wall, muffled but clear enough to make her freeze. I'm telling you, something doesn't add up, he was saying to someone on the phone. The dates are wrong, the locations don't match. I've been through Dad's records 3 times now. Danica's hand clenched around the ice bag, the cold burning through her palm. No, I haven't said anything to Mom yet. But Emma's asking questions, and you know, Sarah, when she gets here tomorrow. Mike's voice carried the frustration of someone used to having all the pieces fit together neatly. Look, I just want to understand. Dad was a good man. Whatever this is, there has to be an explanation. The conversation continued, but Danica had heard enough. The investigation she'd dreaded for decades had begun, and it was being led by her own son, the boy who'd worshipped his father, who'd built his entire sense of moral order around Bob's steady presence. She stood there in the garage, ice bag forgotten, as 40 years of careful silence crumbled around her. All those years of deflecting questions, of changing subjects when certain topics arose, of watching Bob wrestle with guilt while she carried the weight of his confession alone. She'd thought his death would end it, that the secret would die with him. Instead, it was just beginning to live. Through the garage wall, she could hear the reunion continuing, laughter, conversation, the sound of a family that believed it knew its own story. But Danica understood what they didn't, that family stories were like archaeological sites, and if you dug too deep, you might uncover things that changed everything you thought you knew about the ground you stood on. By the time she returned to the kitchen with the ice, her composure was restored, her smile carefully in place. But as she watched Emma showing her genealogy charts to a cluster of curious relatives, as she noted Mike's troubled expression when he thought no one was looking, as she felt the weight of all those loving, trusting faces around her, Danica knew she was running out of time. That evening, after the dishes were cleared and the last of the day visitors had headed home, Danica retreated to the guest bedroom that had been Bob's study. His books still lined the shelves. His reading chair still bore the impression of his form. But now the room felt like a mausoleum to a man whose true story had never been told. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, and tried to calculate how long she had before Emma's research or Mike's investigation uncovered the truth that would shatter their carefully constructed family narrative. A week? A month? Outside her window, she could hear the murmur of Mike and Jennifer's voices as they cleaned up the backyard. Their conversation too low to make out words, but weighted with the kind of tension that suggested difficult topics were being discussed. The secret that had defined her marriage, shaped her motherhood, and consumed decades of her life was finally demanding its due. And Danica Samson, who had spent 40 years protecting her family from a truth she wasn't sure they could handle, now faced the most difficult decision of her life. Whether to let them discover it on their own terms, or take control of a story that had controlled her for far too long. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, but sleep felt impossible. Tomorrow would bring new questions, deeper investigations, and the ever-present possibility that someone would finally dig deep enough to uncover what she'd buried so carefully all those years ago. In the darkness of Bob's old study, surrounded by the books and memories of a man who'd reinvented himself completely, Danica closed her eyes and prepared for the fight of her life. In the darkness of Bob's old study, surrounded by the books and memories of a man who'd reinvented himself completely, Danica closed her eyes and prepared for the fight of her life. But sleep remained elusive, and by 3 a.m. she found herself padding through the quiet house in her slippers, drawn by restlessness and the weight of 40 years of silence. The house held a different quality in these pre-dawn hours, softer somehow, as if the absence of voices and footsteps allowed the walls themselves to exhale. Danica moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost visiting scenes from her own life, each corner holding fragments of the careful construction she and Bob had built together. In the living room, Emma's laptop sat closed on the coffee table, its presence as ominous as a ticking bomb. Beside it, printouts were scattered: family tree diagrams, census records, newspaper clippings. Even in the dim light filtering through the windows, Danica could make out the highlighted discrepancies that had caught her granddaughter's attention. She shouldn't look, she knew that, but her fingers moved of their own accord, lifting the top sheet to reveal a birth certificate with Bob's name, his real name, Marcus Robert Kellerman, crossed out and replaced with question marks in Emma's careful handwriting. The sight of it hit her like a physical blow, transporting her instantly back to that autumn evening in 1983, when Bob had finally found the courage to tell her the truth. They'd been married 8 months. 8 months of what Danica had thought was perfect happiness in their small apartment near the university where she taught. Bob worked construction then, coming home each evening with calloused hands and stories about his crew, his easy laugh filling their tiny kitchen as she graded papers at the table. But that night he'd been different. Quiet. He'd sat across from her, his dinner untouched, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Donnie," he'd said, using the nickname that always made her smile. But there was no warmth in his voice that night. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before we got married." She'd looked up from her stack of essays, pen still in hand, expecting maybe a confession about a previous girlfriend, or some minor deception about his past. She was 27, not naive about the complexities men sometimes carried. Instead, Bob had begun to cry. "My name isn't Robert Samson," he'd whispered. "It's Marcus Kellerman. And I have children. Had children. In Ohio. A wife, an ex-wife. I left them." The memory was so vivid that Danica found herself reaching for the back of Mike's couch for support, her legs suddenly unsteady. Even now, decades later, she could remember the exact tone of Bob's voice, the way the kitchen light had cast shadows across his face, the feeling of her entire world shifting beneath her feet. She forced herself to continue reading Emma's research, though each new detail felt like a nail in the coffin of their family's peace. Emma had been thorough, too thorough. Marriage records from Ohio, showing Marcus Kellerman's union to Linda Walsh in 1979. Birth certificates for 2 children. Rebecca, born 1980, and Joshua, born 1982. A divorce decree dated 6 months before Bob had appeared in Denver, calling himself Robert Samson and claiming to be starting fresh. "I couldn't handle it," Bob had confessed that night, his words tumbling over each other in desperate confession. The marriage was falling apart. Linda was... "We were so young, Donnie. I was 24 when Rebecca was born and I had no idea what I was doing. Linda suffered from depression after Joshua, and I I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't good enough. Danica had set down her pen, her teacher's instincts kicking in, even as her world crumbled. She'd seen this before, young men overwhelmed by responsibility, cracking under pressure they'd never been prepared for. "So you left," she'd said quietly. "I left," he'd confirmed, shame weighing down every syllable. "I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go away for a while, get my head straight, maybe make some money and come back better. But weeks turned into months, and then I met you." The house creaked around her, pulling Danica back to the present. She realized she'd been standing in Mike's living room for nearly an hour, Emma's research scattered around her like evidence at a crime scene. But she wasn't done remembering. The memories demanded their due, especially now that they might finally see daylight. Moving carefully through the house, she made her way to Mike's home office, the same room where she'd overheard his phone conversation earlier. The door was slightly ajar, and moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating what looked like a command center for genealogical investigation. On Mike's desk, file folders were arranged with his characteristic precision. "Dad, military records. Dad, employment history. Dad, marriage and family." Each folder contained photocopies, highlighted documents, handwritten notes in Mike's careful script. Her son had been more thorough than she'd realized. She opened the marriage folder with trembling fingers and found their wedding certificate from 1983, along with copies of Bob's driver's license applications, Social Security records, and employment forms. But underneath those, Mike had compiled something that made her blood run cold: a timeline. 1979. Marcus Kellerman marries Linda Walsh in Columbus, Ohio, 1980. Rebecca Kellerman, born 1982. Joshua Kellerman, born 1982. Marcus Kellerman disappears. No contact with family, 1983. Robert Samson appears in Denver, marries Danica, 1984. Michael Samson, born. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The timeline continued through their entire marriage, but those early entries told the story that would destroy everything. Mike had done the math. He'd figured out that his father had abandoned a family and created a new identity within months of his disappearance. What Mike hadn't found, what no official record could capture, was the rest of Bob's confession that night in 1983. "I tried to contact them," Bob had said through his tears. "After I met you. After I realized I wanted to build something real. I called Linda." "What did she say?" "She hung up on me. When I called back, her brother answered. He said she'd remarried, that the kids were calling their stepfather Dad, that everyone was better off if I stayed away. He said if I tried to contact them again, they'd press charges for abandonment." Danica had studied her husband's face in the kitchen light, searching for deception but finding only devastation. "I should have tried harder," Bob had continued. "I should have fought for them. But Linda's brother was right. They were better off. The kids were little enough that they probably wouldn't even remember me. And I was a coward, Donnie. I took the easy way out and convinced myself it was noble." Danica closed the folder, unable to read more of Mike's careful documentation. Her son was trying to solve a puzzle, but he was missing crucial pieces that only she possessed. She moved to Mike's filing cabinet, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The bottom drawer was locked, but she remembered Mike keeping spare keys in the same pencil holder since he was 12 years old. Some habits never changed. Inside the locked drawer, she found what Mike had been hiding from the rest of the family. Letters. Not copies. Original letters, written in Bob's familiar handwriting, addressed to children who would now be adults. Her hands shook as she lifted the first envelope. Rebecca Kellerman, the address read, though it had been crossed out and rewritten multiple times as if Bob had tried to track down his daughter's changing addresses over the years. The letter was dated just 2 years ago. "Dear Rebecca, I don't know if you remember me. You were so young when I left, and I know that your mother probably told you I was dead. Or worse. Maybe that would have been easier for everyone. I'm writing this letter for the 20th time, and I'll probably never send it, just like all the others. But I want you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you and your brother. I want you to know that leaving you was the worst mistake of my life, and that everything good I've done since then has been an attempt to make up for that failure. I have a family here now, a wife who knows about you, children who would be your half-siblings. They're good people, Rebecca. They would love you if you ever wanted to meet them. But I understand if that's impossible. I understand if you never want to hear from the man who walked away when you needed him most. I'm getting older now, and I'm scared that I'll die without you knowing that you were loved. That you are loved. That my leaving had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own weakness. If you ever want to contact me, I live in Denver now. My wife's name is Danica, and she's the strongest person I know. If something happens to me, she'll tell you the truth about everything. About why I left. About how much I've regretted it. About how proud I am of the woman you've become, because I've kept track as much as I could from a distance. I love you, Rebecca. I've always loved you. Your father, Marcus, Bob. Danica sank into Mike's office chair, the letter clutching at her chest like a physical weight. There were dozens more in the drawer. Letters to Rebecca, letters to Joshua, letters that tracked their lives from a distance while Bob built a new family in Denver. He'd kept track of them. Somehow, through all these years, he'd been following their lives. Rebecca had become a nurse, married a teacher, had 2 children of her own. Joshua had joined the military, served overseas, now worked for a veterans organization. Bob had documented their achievements like a proud father, even as he maintained his distance. The final letter in the stack was different. It was addressed to Danica herself, in an envelope marked, "To be opened only if something happens to me." With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. "My dearest Danny, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with questions about my past. I know how much this secret has cost you over the years, how many times you've had to deflect curiosity or change the subject when people asked about my family. I need you to know that you don't have to protect me anymore. If Mike or the kids find out about Rebecca and Joshua, you can tell them the truth, all of it. They deserve to know that their father was flawed, but that he tried every day to be better than the man who walked away from his first family. In this drawer, you'll find contact information for both Rebecca and Joshua. I've kept track over the years, though I never had the courage to reach out directly. Rebecca lives in Cincinnati now. Joshua is in Portland. They both turned out to be remarkable people, despite having a coward for a father. If our family wants to reach out to them, I hope they will. Maybe it's too late for me to make amends, but it's not too late for our children to know they have siblings. It's not too late for Rebecca and Joshua to know they have a family who would welcome them. Rika B. Terry Dyer. I love you, Danny. Thank you for carrying this burden with me. Thank you for loving me despite my failures. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Forever yours, Bob. Danica set the letter down with shaking hands, her mind reeling. Bob had been preparing for this moment, preparing for his death, for the questions that would follow, for the possibility that his past would finally catch up with him. He'd left her a roadmap for handling the truth, but he'd also left her a choice. As dawn began to creep through Mike's office windows, Danica realized that her son's investigation wasn't random curiosity or an insurance adjuster's compulsive need for documentation. Mike had found something, maybe one of these letters, maybe a different piece of evidence, that had started him down this path. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Someone else was awake, moving through the house with the careful steps of someone trying not to wake others. Quickly, she returned the letters to their drawer and locked it, slipping the key back into the pencil holder, just as the office door opened wider. "Mom?" Mike's voice was soft, concerned. "What are you doing up?" She turned to face her son, this man who looked so much like Bob in his younger years, who had inherited his father's sense of justice and his mother's determination. In the pale dawnlight, she could see the weight he was carrying, the burden of questions without answers, the fear that his investigation might hurt the people he loved. "Couldn't sleep," she said simply. "I was just remembering." Mike stepped into the office, his eyes taking in the organized chaos of his investigation. "Me neither. This whole thing with Dad's records. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Danica's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "What is it, sweetheart? Did Dad ever tell you anything about his life before Denver? Anything that might explain why none of the official records line up? The question hung between them in the growing light, and Danica realized that this was her moment of choice. She could lie, as she had for 40 years. She could deflect and protect and carry the burden a little longer. Or she could honor Bob's final letter and begin the process of setting them all free. Instead, she did what teachers do when confronted with a difficult question. She bought herself time. "Mike," she said carefully, "some stories are complicated. And some truths change everything once they're spoken." Her son's eyes sharpened with the recognition that his mother had just confirmed his worst fears. There was a truth to be found, and it was big enough to matter. "Mom," he said quietly, "whatever it is, we can handle it. As a family." Danica looked at her son, this good man who'd built his life on the foundation of his father's love, who was about to learn that foundations could be more complex than they appeared, and made a decision that would change everything. "I need to make a phone call first," she said, "to Pastor David. Then we'll talk." "I need to make a phone call first," she said, "to Pastor David. Then we'll talk." Mike's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, understanding mixed with apprehension. He nodded slowly, recognizing that his mother was about to cross a line she'd been guarding for years. 2 hours later, Danica sat in her car outside Riverside Methodist Church, watching Pastor David unlock the sanctuary doors in the early morning light. At 68, David moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body reminded him daily of time's passage, but his eyes still held the sharp compassion that had drawn people to him for decades. He'd agreed to meet her without questions when she'd called, though the weight in her voice had told him everything he needed to know. "Danica." David's greeting was soft as she approached the church steps. "It's time, isn't it?" Quote, dot. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. David had been waiting for this conversation for years, just as she had been dreading it. Inside the quiet sanctuary, they sat in the front pew, where she and Bob had shared so many Sunday mornings. The colored light filtering through stained glass windows cast familiar patterns across the worn wooden floors, but today even this sacred space felt different. "Mike found the letters," she said without preamble. David's weathered hands stilled on his Bible. "All of them?" "The ones Bob wrote to Rebecca and Joshua. The one he left for me." Her voice cracked slightly. "David, Mike's been investigating for weeks. Emma's building family trees. They're so close to the truth that I can't protect them anymore. Maybe it's time to stop protecting them from it." The words hung between them like a challenge. David had been Bob's confessor for 35 years, the only other person who'd carried the weight of Marcus Kellerman's transformation into Robert Samson. "You don't understand," Danica said. "Mike worshipped his father. This will destroy how he sees everything, his childhood, his values, his understanding of what love looks like. Or it might show him that love is more complicated than he thought." David's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd counseled families through devastating revelations before. "Danica, what are you really afraid of?" The question hit deeper than she'd expected. "I'm afraid they'll hate him. I'm afraid they'll think everything we built was a lie." Was it a lie? No. The answer came immediately, fierce and certain. Bob became the man they remember. He earned that love every single day. Then trust them to see that. Through the sanctuary windows, Danica could see early churchgoers beginning to arrive for the 8 o'clock service. Soon this conversation would have to end, and she'd return to a house full of family members who were asking increasingly pointed questions. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Bob kept contact information for Rebecca and Joshua, current addresses, phone numbers. He'd been following their lives." David's eyes widened slightly. This was news to him. What if the family wants to reach out to them? What if this doesn't just destroy our family's peace, but theirs too? What if it brings healing instead of destruction? The sound of car doors closing in the parking lot reminded them both that their private moment was ending. David reached over and covered Danica's hands with his own. "I can't make this decision for you," he said, "but I can tell you that secrets have a way of growing heavier over time, not lighter. And I can tell you that your family is stronger than you think." "Mike's in the parking lot," Danica said, glancing through the window. "He followed me here." David smiled sadly. "Then maybe the choice is being made for both of you." As the first members of the early service began filing into the sanctuary, Danica realized that her 40-year guardianship of Bob's secret was finally coming to an end. Whether she controlled how the truth emerged or let it unfold naturally, the story of Marcus Kellerman was about to become part of the Samson family narrative. The only question now was whether that truth would tear them apart or set them free. The only question now was whether that truth would tear them apart or set them free. Danica watched through the sanctuary window as Mike sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, clearly wrestling with whether to come inside. The early service was beginning around them, but she felt disconnected from the familiar hymns and prayers, her entire focus on the son who'd followed her here seeking answers she wasn't ready to give. Pastor David squeezed her hand once more before moving to greet his arriving congregation. "Whatever you decide," he whispered, "you won't face it alone." By the time Danica made it to the parking lot, Mike was leaning against his car, his insurance adjuster's composure cracking at the edges. The morning sun cast long shadows between them, and she could see the sleepless night etched in the lines around his eyes. "You came to talk to Pastor David about Dad," he said. It wasn't a question. "I came to talk to an old friend about a difficult situation." "Mom, please." Mike's voice carried a note of desperation she hadn't heard since he was a child. "I found something yesterday, in Dad's things." A letter addressed to someone named Rebecca Kellerman. Danica's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. The sound that escaped her was part gasp, part sob. The sound of 40 years of vigilance finally breaking down. "You read it?" "I couldn't help myself. And then I found the others." Mike stepped closer, his expression shifting from interrogation to concern. "Mom, who is Rebecca Kellerman? Who is Joshua? And why was Dad writing letters to children he claimed he never had?" The drive back to the house passed in heavy silence. Danica knew that within hours, the entire family would know that Bob's past held secrets significant enough to send his widow to church for guidance and reduce his son to following her for answers. But it was Sarah's rental car in the driveway that made Danica's stomach drop completely. Her younger daughter had arrived early from California, and Sarah never arrived anywhere without a reason. Inside, the house buzzed with a different energy than the day before. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, genealogy charts spread around her like evidence at a trial. Sarah stood behind her, reading over her shoulder with the clinical detachment she brought to her veterinary practice. "Interesting family tree," Sarah said without looking up as Danica and Mike entered. "Lots of gaps in the early years. Almost like someone was trying to hide something." Jennifer emerged from the kitchen, her diplomatic skills in full deployment mode. "Sarah, maybe we should wait for everyone to get here before we start discussing family history." "Why?" Sarah's directness had always been both her strength and her weapon. "We're all adults. If there's something unusual about Dad's past, shouldn't we talk about it openly?" Tyler appeared in the doorway, his artistic sensitivity immediately picking up on the tension. "What's going on?" "Everyone feels heavy." Emma looked up from her laptop, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. "I've been trying to trace Grandpa Bob's family history for my wedding project, but there are some discrepancies in the records. His birth certificate, his early marriage records, they don't match what we've always been told." "What kind of discrepancies?" Mike asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Well, for one thing, there's a marriage certificate from Ohio in 1979 for someone named Marcus Kellerman who matches Dad's description and birth date exactly. And this Marcus had 2 children before disappearing in 1982. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Danica felt the weight of every gaze in the room, saw the moment when her family began to understand that their carefully constructed history was built on foundations of sand. There has to be an explanation, Jennifer said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah crossed her arms, her scientific mind already working through the implications. The dates line up perfectly with when Dad supposedly moved to Denver to start fresh. And Mom, you met him in 1983. Right after this, Marcus Kellerman disappeared from Ohio. Sarah, please, Danica began, but her daughter held up a hand. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just saying that if Dad had reasons for changing his name, for creating a new identity, we should understand what those reasons were, especially if there are people out there who might be looking for him. People like his first wife and children, Emma added quietly, her laptop screen showing what appeared to be current contact information. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Bob's clock, bought during their second year of marriage, when they'd believed they had all the time in the world to build their life together. Mike sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his methodical world clearly shaken. Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. Did Dad abandon a family in Ohio before he met you? Every face in the room turned toward Danica. Her children, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, her granddaughter, all waiting for her to either confirm their worst fears or provide an explanation that would make sense of the evidence they'd assembled. She looked at each of them, these people she'd protected for decades, and realized that protection might have been another word for control. They weren't children anymore. They were adults capable of handling complex truths, of understanding that love could coexist with failure, that redemption was possible even after terrible mistakes. Yes, she said simply. He did. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and understanding through her family. Emma's hands stilled on her keyboard. Sarah's clinical detachment flickered for just a moment. Mike's face went through a series of expressions: hurt, confusion, anger, and something that might have been relief that the truth was finally emerging. But that's not the whole story, Danica continued, her teacher's voice taking over even as her heart hammered against her ribs. And if you want to understand your father, really understand him, then you need to hear all of it. Tyler moved closer to his grandmother, his young face serious but not afraid. We're listening, Grandma. For the first time in 40 years, Danica Samson prepared to tell the complete truth about the man her family had loved, mourned, and thought they knew. For the first time in 40 years, Danica Samson prepared to tell the complete truth about the man her family had loved, mourned, and thought they knew. But before she could begin, the doorbell rang with the insistent chime that suggested someone had been pressing it repeatedly. Jennifer hurried to answer it, returning moments later with Carol Henderson, who took one look at the tense faces around the kitchen table and immediately understood that her planned visit had coincided with a family crisis. I can come back later, Carol said, but her eyes were already assessing Danica's pale complexion and shaking hands with the practiced concern of a retired nurse. No, Danica said quickly. Please stay. I might need a friend right now. The next hour unfolded like a careful surgery, with Danica revealing Bob's story piece by piece while her family absorbed each new revelation. She told them about Marcus Kellerman's young marriage, his overwhelming sense of failure as a husband and father, his cowardly escape to Denver. She explained her own choice to protect him, to help him become the man he wanted to be, rather than condemn him for the man he'd been. But it was Tyler who asked the question that shifted everything. Grandma, he said quietly, his artist's sensitivity picking up on nuances the others missed. You said Grandpa wrote letters to Rebecca and Joshua. Did he love them? The question broke something open in Danica's chest. Oh, sweetheart, he loved them desperately. That's what made it so hard. He didn't leave because he didn't care. He left because he cared too much and couldn't handle failing them. Sarah, who had listened with clinical detachment, finally spoke. So he had children who grew up thinking their father abandoned them because he didn't love them enough to stay. Yes. And now they're adults who might have spent their entire lives wondering what they did wrong. Danica nodded, tears finally spilling over. That's what haunted your father every day we were married. The room fell silent as the full weight of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just about their family's history. It was about two people in Ohio who had lived with the consequences of Bob's choices for over 40 years. Emma closed her laptop slowly. I found contact information for them. Rebecca lives in Cincinnati. She's a nurse, married, has 2 kids. Joshua's in Portland, works with veterans. They both seem to have built good lives. Without him, Mike said, his voice hollow. It was Jennifer who surprised everyone by standing up and moving to sit beside Danica. "I need to say something," she announced, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing classroom dynamics. "I've been watching this family tear itself apart for the past 2 days, and I think we're focusing on the wrong questions." All eyes turned to her. Jennifer rarely took center stage in family discussions, preferring her role as mediator and peacekeeper. "Mike, you've been investigating your father's past like you're trying to prove he was either a hero or a villain. But people aren't insurance claims. They're not simple categories of good or bad." She looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "Your father made a terrible mistake when he was young. He also spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it by being the best husband and father he could be to us." "But what about Rebecca and Joshua?" Emma asked. "Don't they deserve to know that he thought about them? That he regretted leaving?" "Maybe," Jennifer said carefully. "But that's not our decision to make. That's theirs." Carol, who had been quietly observing from her chair by the window, finally spoke. "I think Jennifer's right. This family has spent the morning acting like you have to choose between loving Bob and condemning him. But love isn't that simple." She looked directly at Mike, whose struggle was written across his face. "Your father was a complex man who made both terrible and wonderful choices. The question isn't whether you can forgive him. It's whether you can understand that forgiveness and disappointment can exist at the same time." Tyler, who had been sketching absently in the margins of Emma's genealogy charts, held up his drawing. It showed a tree with deep roots extending in multiple directions, some growing toward light, others disappearing into darkness. "Families are like this," he said. "We all grow from the same roots, but we don't all grow the same way." The simple wisdom of his observations seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere. Sarah, who had been rigid with anger, relaxed slightly. Mike's clenched jaw loosened. Emma looked at her research with new eyes. "So what do we do now?" Emma asked. Danica felt the weight of 40 years of secrecy finally lifting from her shoulders. "I think," she said slowly, "that we start by deciding what kind of family we want to be. Do we want to be the kind that hides from difficult truths, or the kind that faces them together?" "Together," Tyler said immediately. "But what about Rebecca and Joshua?" Sarah asked, her scientific mind still focused on the practical implications. "If we decide to reach out to them, we could be disrupting their lives, bringing up painful memories they've probably spent years processing. Or," Carol suggested gently, "we could be giving them answers they've been waiting their whole lives to receive." Jennifer stood up and began clearing the genealogy papers from the table with the efficient movements of someone taking charge. "I think we need to step back from this for today. We've all learned something huge about our family, and everyone needs time to process it before we make any decisions about contacting Bob's other children." "Other children," Mike repeated, as if testing how the words felt. "My half-siblings." "Your father's other children," Danica corrected gently. "You're all his children. That never changed." As the family began to disperse, Sarah going for a walk to clear her head, Emma retreating to her room with her laptop, Tyler heading to the backyard to sketch, Jennifer lingered in the kitchen with Danica and Carol. "How are you holding up?" she asked Danica, her concern genuine. "Better than I expected," Danica admitted. "It feels strange, not carrying this alone anymore." Carol squeezed her friend's hand. "You never had to carry it alone. You chose to." "I wanted to protect them," Danica said, gesturing toward the rooms where her family was processing the morning's revelations. "I know," Jennifer said, "but maybe it's time to let them protect you for a while." Later that evening, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Danica sat in Bob's old study surrounded by the evidence of his double life. The letters he'd never sent, the newspaper clippings tracking his abandoned children's achievements, the photographs he'd somehow obtained over the years, showing Rebecca's wedding and Joshua's military graduation. For 40 years, she'd been the guardian of his secret. Now, for the first time, she wasn't alone in carrying the weight of Marcus Kellerman's legacy. Her family knew the truth, and they were still here, still loving each other, still committed to figuring out how to move forward together. Tomorrow would bring new questions, difficult decisions about whether to reach out to Rebecca and Joshua, complex conversations about how to honor both sides of Bob's story. But tonight, as Danica finally drifted toward the first peaceful sleep she'd had in years, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Bob's confession 40 years ago. Hope. The truth hadn't destroyed them. Instead, it had given them the chance to become a family that could hold complexity, embrace imperfection, and choose love even in the face of difficult realities. Outside her window, the Denver suburbs stretched toward the mountains, and somewhere in Cincinnati and Portland, two people she'd never met but had thought about for decades were living their lives, unaware that a family in Colorado was finally ready to acknowledge their existence. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. It already had. The question was what they would all choose to do with it. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. It already had. The question was what they would all choose to do with it. But Danica's peaceful sleep was shattered at 6 a.m. by the sound of Emma's voice drifting through the thin walls, urgent and excited. She was on the phone in the guest room next door, and her words made Danica's blood freeze. "Yes, I understand this is unusual, but I'm researching my family genealogy, and I believe you might have information about my grandfather, Marcus Kellerman." Danica was out of bed and in the hallway before she fully understood what she was doing. Through Emma's partially open door, she could see her granddaughter pacing, laptop open, phone pressed to her ear with the determination of a journalist following a lead. "I see. Yes, I could email you some documentation." "What? He tried to contact you?" Emma's voice rose in excitement. "When was this?" Panic flooded Danica's system. Emma had found someone who knew Marcus Kellerman, someone who might have information that could change everything they thought they understood about Bob's departure from Ohio. She knocked softly on the doorframe. Emma looked up, her face flushed with the thrill of discovery, and gestured for her grandmother to come in. "Could you hold on just one moment?" Emma said into the phone, then covered the receiver. "Grandma, you're not going to believe this. I found someone who actually knew Grandpa in Ohio, a neighbor of his first wife. She says he tried to contact the family several times over the years." Danica's legs felt unsteady. "Emma, maybe you should hang up. We agreed yesterday to take time before making any decisions." "But this isn't about contacting Rebecca or Joshua," Emma interrupted, her journalistic instincts overriding family diplomacy. "This is about understanding what really happened. This woman says the story we heard yesterday might not be the whole truth." Before Danica could respond, Emma was back on the phone. "Yes, I'm sorry. Could you tell me more about those attempts at contact?" Danica stood frozen in the doorway, listening as her granddaughter uncovered information that could reshape everything they thought they knew about Bob's abandonment of his first family. "He sent money?" Emma's eyes widened. "For how long? Through a lawyer? And the family knew?" Each revelation hit Danica like a physical blow. Bob had never told her about sending money. He'd never mentioned ongoing contact through legal channels. Her understanding of his guilt, his regret, his complete abandonment of his responsibilities, it was all being rewritten by a stranger's voice on the phone. "I see. And Rebecca and Joshua, they knew about the payments? They chose not to respond to his letters?" Emma was taking notes now, her genealogist's thoroughness capturing every detail. "Do you happen to know if they ever tried to contact him?" Danica sank into the room's single chair, her mind reeling. If Bob had been sending money, if there had been ongoing attempts at contact that he'd never shared with her, then what else had he kept secret? How many layers of protection had he built around his shame? "Yes, I understand. Thank you so much for your time. Would it be possible? Could I get contact information for Rebecca or Joshua? I think it's time our families knew about each other." "Emma?" "No," Danica started, but her granddaughter was already writing down phone numbers. "Thank you. Yes, I'll be respectful. I understand this is delicate." Emma hung up and turned to face her grandmother, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a mystery solved. "Grandma, everything we thought we knew about Grandpa's relationship with his first family is wrong." "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Patterson, that was his neighbor. She says Grandpa never completely disappeared. He sent monthly payments for child support through a lawyer for 15 years. He wrote letters every birthday and Christmas. He even tried to arrange supervised visits when Rebecca graduated high school." Danica felt the room spinning slightly. Bob never told me. The family refused contact, but they kept the money. And get this, Rebecca actually wrote him back once when she got married. She sent him a wedding photo and a letter saying she forgave him, but didn't want him in her life. The implications of this information cascaded through Danica's mind. Bob hadn't been the complete coward she'd believed. He'd been trying to make amends, to maintain some connection to his children, while protecting her from the ongoing complexity of his past. "Emma," she said carefully, "what exactly did you tell this woman about our family?" "Just that I was researching our genealogy and had discovered Grandpa's first marriage. I didn't give her our contact information or anything specific about where we live." Relief flooded through Danica, but it was short-lived. Emma was still holding the piece of paper with phone numbers, and her expression suggested she had every intention of using them. "You're going to call them, aren't you?" "I think we have to. Don't you see? This changes everything." If Grandpa was trying to maintain contact, if he was supporting them financially, then maybe Rebecca and Joshua don't hate him the way we thought. Maybe they'd want to know that he died, that he thought about them every day. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of other family members, drawn by the sound of conversation. Mike appeared first, already dressed for the day despite the early hour, followed by Jennifer carrying 2 cups of coffee. "What's going on?" Mike asked, noting the tension in the room. Emma launched into her discoveries with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just solved a decades-old mystery. As she spoke, Mike's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something that might have been pride. "He was paying child support?" Mike asked. "For 15 years? Through a lawyer in Columbus. Mrs. Patterson says everyone in the neighborhood knew. The payment stopped when both kids turned 18, but the letters continued until just a few years ago." Jennifer set down her coffee cups and moved to stand beside Danica. "How are you processing this?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Danica admitted. "I thought I knew everything. I thought I was carrying all of his secrets." "Maybe he was trying to protect you the same way you were trying to protect us," Jennifer suggested. The observation was both comforting and troubling. If Bob had been maintaining contact with his first family while building his new life with her, then their entire marriage had been built on incomplete truths from both sides. Tyler wandered in, drawn by the family gathering, followed by Sarah, who looked like she'd been up for hours. The small guest room was now crowded with Samsons, all focused on the phone numbers in Emma's hand. "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, her directness cutting through the emotional complexity. "Are we calling them or not?" "I think we should," Emma said immediately. "We have a right to know our family history, and they have a right to know that Grandpa died." "It's not about rights," Mike said slowly. "It's about what's best for everyone involved." "How can we know what's best if we don't know what they want?" Tyler asked, his young voice carrying surprising wisdom. Danica looked around the room at her family, these people who'd discovered yesterday that their beloved patriarch had abandoned his first children, only to learn today that the abandonment had been far more complicated than they'd understood. They were handling the revelations with a resilience that both surprised and humbled her. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Yesterday, when I found your grandfather's letters, I also found current contact information. He'd been keeping track of their lives for years." The room fell silent. "He knew where they lived?" Emma asked. "He knew everything. Their careers, their marriages, their children. He had newspaper clippings about Joshua's military service, photos of Rebecca's wedding. He'd been following their lives from a distance for decades." "Like a guardian angel," Tyler said softly. "Or a stalker," Sarah added, though her tone was more thoughtful than accusatory. Jennifer moved closer to Danica. "The question is, What do we do with all this information? Emma has contact numbers. We know they've been aware of Bob's attempts to reach out. We know he supported them financially. But we still don't know if they want anything to do with us. Pastor David's arrival at the front door interrupted their deliberations. Danica heard his familiar voice talking with Carol in the living room, and she realized that word of yesterday's revelations had reached their wider circle of support. "I asked him to come," Carol called from the hallway. "I thought you might need some guidance." As Pastor David joined their crowded gathering, Danica felt the weight of decision pressing down on them all. They had information, they had contact numbers, they had a family history that was far more complex than any of them had imagined. But they also had each other, a family that had survived the revelation of long-held secrets and emerged stronger rather than broken. The question now was whether they were ready to extend that strength beyond their own walls, to reach across 40 years of silence and separation to connect with the people Bob had never stopped loving, never stopped missing, and never stopped trying to reach. Emma looked at the phone numbers in her hand, then at the faces surrounding her. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should vote, all of us, together." And in that moment, Danica realized that her granddaughter had inherited more than Bob's sense of justice. She'd inherited his belief that family decisions should be made by families, that love required courage, and that some bridges were worth building even when you couldn't see the other side. And in that moment, Danica realized that her granddaughter had inherited more than Bob's sense of justice. She'd inherited his belief that family decisions should be made by families, that love required courage, and that some bridges were worth building even when you couldn't see the other side. But before they could vote, Emma's phone rang. The caller ID showed an Ohio number, the same area code as the contact information she'd written down. "It's her," Emma whispered, staring at the screen. "It's Rebecca." The room fell completely silent. Pastor David moved closer, his pastoral instincts recognizing a moment of profound significance. Carol reached for Danica's hand. Mike's insurance adjuster's mind was clearly calculating odds and possibilities. "Should I answer it?" Emma asked, looking around the room at her family. "Yes," Danica said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Put it on speaker." Emma swiped to answer. "Hello? Is this Emma Samson Walker?" The voice was warm but cautious, with a slight Ohio accent that reminded Danica achingly of Bob in his younger years. "Yes, it is. This is Rebecca Miller. Rebecca Kellerman Miller. Mrs. Patterson called me after she spoke with you this morning. She said you were asking about Marcus, about my biological father." The word biological hung in the air like a careful boundary, neither claiming nor rejecting connection. "Yes," Emma said carefully. "I'm his granddaughter. Tomorrow would bring new questions. Difficult decisions about whether to reach out to Rebecca and Joshua. Complex conversations about how to honor both sides of Bob's story. But tonight, as Danica finally drifted toward the first peaceful sleep she'd had in years, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Bob's confession 40 years ago. Hope. The truth hadn't destroyed them. Instead, it had given them the chance to become a family that could hold complexity, embrace imperfection, and choose love even in the face of difficult realities. Outside her window, the Denver suburbs stretched toward the mountains, and somewhere in Cincinnati and Portland, two people she'd never met but had thought about for decades were living their lives, unaware that a family in Colorado was finally ready to acknowledge their existence. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. It already had. The question was what they would all choose to do with it. The question now wasn't whether the truth would come out. It already had. The question was what they would all choose to do with it. But Danica's peaceful sleep was shattered at 6 a.m. by the sound of Emma's voice drifting through the thin walls, urgent and excited. She was on the phone in the guest room next door, and her words made Danica's blood freeze. "Yes, I understand this is unusual, but I'm researching my family genealogy, and I believe you might have information about my grandfather, Marcus Kellerman." Danica was out of bed and in the hallway before she fully understood what she was doing. Through Emma's partially open door, she could see her granddaughter pacing, laptop open, phone pressed to her ear with the determination of a journalist following a lead. I see. Yes, I could email you some documentation. What? He tried to contact you? Emma's voice rose in excitement. When was this? Panic flooded Danica's system. Emma had found someone who knew Marcus Kellerman, someone who might have information that could change everything they thought they understood about Bob's departure from Ohio. She knocked softly on the doorframe. Emma looked up, her face flushed with the thrill of discovery, and gestured for her grandmother to come in. Could you hold on just one moment? Emma said into the phone, then covered the receiver. Grandma, you're not going to believe this. I found someone who actually knew Grandpa in Ohio, a neighbor of his first wife. She says he tried to contact the family several times over the years. Danica's legs felt unsteady. Emma, maybe you should hang up. We agreed yesterday to take time before making any decisions. But this isn't about contacting Rebecca or Joshua, Emma interrupted, her journalistic instincts overriding family diplomacy. This is about understanding what really happened. This woman says the story we heard yesterday might not be the whole truth. Before Danica could respond, Emma was back on the phone. Yes, I'm sorry. Could you tell me more about those attempts at contact? Danica stood frozen in the doorway, listening as her granddaughter uncovered information that could reshape everything they thought they knew about Bob's abandonment of his first family. He sent money? Emma's eyes widened. For how long? Through a lawyer? And the family knew? Each revelation hit Danica like a physical blow. Bob had never told her about sending money. He'd never mentioned ongoing contact through legal channels. Her understanding of his guilt, his regret, his complete abandonment of his responsibilities, it was all being rewritten by a stranger's voice on the phone. I see. And Rebecca and Joshua, they knew about the payments? They chose not to respond to his letters? Emma was taking notes now, her genealogist's thoroughness capturing every detail. Do you happen to know if they ever tried to contact him? Danica sank into the room's single chair, her mind reeling. If Bob had been sending money, if there had been ongoing attempts at contact that he'd never shared with her, then what else had he kept secret? How many layers of protection had he built around his shame? Yes, I understand. Thank you so much for your time. Would it be possible? Could I get contact information for Rebecca or Joshua? I think it's time our families knew about each other. Emma? No, Danica started, but her granddaughter was already writing down phone numbers. There's one more thing, Rebecca said hesitantly. The last letter I got from him was about 3 years ago. He said if anything ever happened to him, there was someone named Danica who could tell us the whole truth about everything. That she was the only person who really knew him. All eyes turned to Danica, who felt the weight of Bob's final trust settling on her shoulders. I'm Danica, she said quietly. And if you want to know the whole truth, I'm ready to tell it. After Rebecca hung up with a promise to call back within the week, the family sat in stunned silence. The abstract possibility of contact had become a concrete reality, and the weight of that reality was sinking in. She kept the letters, Tyler said wonderfully. Even when she told him to stop writing, she kept them. They know about all of us, Mike said, still processing the revelation that his half-sister had been watching his life unfold through their father's correspondence. They've known about us for years. Emma was staring at her phone as if it might ring again. What if Joshua doesn't want contact? What if Rebecca changes her mind? Then we'll handle that too, Jennifer said firmly. But at least now they know their father is gone. They know he never stopped loving them. Whatever they decide from here is their choice to make. Pastor David stood to leave, his pastoral duties calling him elsewhere. You've all handled this with remarkable grace, he said. Whatever comes next, you'll face it together. As he reached the door, he turned back. Danica, Bob would be proud of how you've protected and honored his memory while still allowing the truth to emerge. That takes real wisdom. After he left, the family remained in the guest room, each processing the morning's revelations in their own way. They had crossed a line, from protecting a family secret to actively engaging with the people that secret had affected. There was no going back now. Rebecca and Joshua knew about them, just as they now knew about Rebecca and Joshua. The question was no longer whether the two halves of Bob's family would connect, but how that connection would reshape all their lives. In the quiet that followed, Danica realized that for the first time in 40 years, she was no longer the sole keeper of Bob's story. The burden and the possibility now belonged to all of them. In the quiet that followed, Danica realized that for the first time in 40 years, she was no longer the sole keeper of Bob's story. The burden and the possibility now belonged to all of them. But the weight of that realization was interrupted by Mike's sudden movement toward the door. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking in a way that reminded Danica of Bob during his worst moments of guilt and regret. "I need some air," he said, his voice tight. "Mike, wait." Jennifer started, but he was already heading downstairs. They found him in the backyard, sitting heavily on the picnic table, where just 2 days ago the family had gathered for what they'd thought was a simple reunion. His shoulders were shaking, and when he looked up at his approaching family, his face was streaked with tears. "She knew about my baseball games," he said, his voice breaking. "My graduation. My wedding. She's been watching my life happen through Dad's letters, and I never even knew she existed." Danica sat beside her son, the morning sun warm on her back but unable to reach the cold place in her chest. "Mike." "No, Mom, you don't understand." Mike turned to face her, and she saw 45 years of trust wavering in his eyes. "I spent my entire childhood trying to make Dad proud, working hard in school, playing baseball, becoming the kind of man he could respect, and all this time he was writing letters to other children, telling them about my achievements like I was some kind of proof that he could be a good father." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah moved closer, her veterinarian's instincts recognizing a wounded creature. "Mike, that's not—" Emma began, but Mike held up a hand. "Isn't it? Think about it, Emma. Every school play, every graduation, every milestone. Dad was documenting it all for the children he abandoned. We weren't just his family. We were his evidence that he'd changed, his proof that he deserved forgiveness." "And what's wrong with that?" Sarah asked, her directness cutting through Mike's emotional spiral. "What's wrong with Dad trying to show Rebecca and Joshua that he'd learned how to be a better father?" "Because it means our entire childhood was performance." Mike's voice rose, carrying across the backyard. "Every time he told me he was proud of me, every time he came to my games, every time he said he loved me, was that real? Or was that him trying to prove something to the family he left behind?" The question hit Danica like a punch to the stomach. In 40 years of carrying Bob's secret, she'd never considered how the truth might make her children question the authenticity of their father's love. Jennifer sat on Mike's other side, her teacher's instincts engaging. "Mike, honey, love isn't diminished by being shared. Dad loving Rebecca and Joshua doesn't mean he loved you less. But it means he loved us differently," Mike shot back. "We were his second chance, his do-over, his chance to prove he wasn't the man who walked away from his responsibilities." Tyler, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. "So what if we were his second chance? Doesn't everyone deserve a second chance?" "Not at the expense of other people's pain," Mike said, his insurance adjuster's sense of fairness reasserting itself. "Tyler, Rebecca and Joshua grew up thinking their father didn't love them enough to stay. Meanwhile, we grew up with a father who was trying so hard to be perfect that maybe none of it was real." "It was real," Danica said firmly, her teacher's voice cutting through the emotional chaos. "Mike, I need you to listen to me. Every moment your father spent with you, every word of pride, every expression of love, it was completely real." "How can you know that?" "Because I lived with him for 43 years. I saw how he struggled with guilt, yes. But I also saw how you children transformed him. You didn't just give him a chance to prove he could be a good father. You made him want to be a good father." Carol, who had been quietly observing from the porch, finally spoke. "Mike, you're asking the wrong questions." All eyes turned to her. "You're asking whether your father's love was authentic, whether your childhood was real, whether you were just proof of his redemption. But those aren't the right questions." "What are the right questions?" Mike asked, his voice raw. The right questions are, did your father love you? Did he show up for you? Did he make you feel valued and supported? Did he help you become the man you are today? Mike was quiet for a long moment, considering. Yes, he finally admitted. Yes to all of that. Then everything else is just context, Carol said gently. The fact that he was trying to heal old wounds doesn't diminish the love he gave you. It just means he was human. Emma, who had been taking notes throughout the conversation, her journalist's habits even extending to family crises, looked up from her notebook. Mike, what if we look at this differently? What if Dad's letters to Rebecca and Joshua weren't about proving himself through us, but about sharing us with them? About wanting them to know they had siblings who would love them? The observation shifted something in Mike's expression. You think he wanted us to know about each other? I think he wanted us to be a family, Emma said simply. All of us. But he didn't know how to make that happen without risking everything he'd built here. Jennifer squeezed Mike's hand. The man who raised you, who taught you right from wrong, who showed you how to be a husband and father? That man was real, Mike. His love for you was real. The fact that he was also grieving his other children doesn't change that. Tyler pulled out his sketchbook and showed them a drawing he'd been working on. 2 trees growing from the same root system, their branches reaching toward each other across a divide. Families aren't perfect, he said with the wisdom of someone who saw the world through artists' eyes. But they're still families, even when they're complicated. Point. He passed away 6 months ago. A long pause. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was softer. I'm sorry for your loss. Mrs. Patterson said you had questions about his relationship with our family. We recently learned about you and your brother, Emma continued. Our grandmother, his wife. She told us yesterday that he'd had another family before ours. We're trying to understand what happened. What did she tell you? Emma glanced at Danica, who nodded encouragingly. That he left when you and Joshua were very young. That he regretted it every day of his life. That he loved you but felt he'd failed you too badly to ever make it right. Another pause, longer this time. That's mostly true, but it's not the whole story. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he sent support payments for 15 years. Through a lawyer. He never missed a month. Rebecca's voice carried a complexity of emotions, gratitude mixed with old hurt. He also sent letters, birthday cards, Christmas cards, photos sometimes, of his new family. Mike leaned forward, his voice tight. Photos of us? You must be Michael. Yes, your school pictures, your baseball games, your graduation. He wanted us to know he had other children, that we weren't being replaced but that he was, trying to be better. The words hit Mike like a physical blow. He sent you pictures of me? Every year, you looked just like him when he was young. Rebecca's voice softened slightly. And there's a young man there who must be Tyler. I saw photos of his art shows. And Emma, I know about your journalism degree. He was very proud of all of you. Emma's eyes filled with tears. He told you about us? In his letters. He never stopped writing. Even after we asked him to. Even after we told him we'd built our lives without him and didn't want contact? Rebecca paused. Though I have to admit, getting those letters, knowing he was thinking about us, it meant something. Jennifer stepped closer to the phone. I'm Jennifer, Mike's wife. Can I ask, how did you and your brother feel about receiving those letters? It was complicated. Joshua was angrier than I was. He destroyed most of his letters without reading them. But I kept mine. All of them. Even when I asked him to stop writing, I kept them. Sarah, who had been listening with clinical attention, finally spoke. Why didn't you ever respond, other than the wedding photo? Because we were scared, Rebecca said simply. Scared that if we opened that door, he'd disappoint us again. We'd built a life where our stepfather was our dad, where Marcus Kellerman was just a name on our birth certificates. Letting him back in felt dangerous. But you kept the letters, Tyler said softly. I kept the letters. And when I had children of my own, I started to understand how someone could make terrible mistakes out of fear and weakness rather than lack of love. Pastor David, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Rebecca, this is Pastor David Mitchell. I was your father's pastor here in Denver. He talked about you and Joshua often. The guilt he carried, it never left him. Pastor Mitchell, Rebecca's voice held recognition. He mentioned you in his letters. Said you were helping him find peace with his choices. I tried to encourage him to reach out more directly, but he was convinced you were better off without him. Maybe we were, when we were children. But now... Rebecca's voice trailed off. Mrs. Patterson said you were calling to share family history, but what do you really want? The question cut to the heart of everything. Emma looked around the room at her family, then at the phone. We want to know if you'd like to know us, she said simply. We just found out you existed 2 days ago, and we're still figuring out how to process everything. But if you and Joshua want to know about your father's life here, about us, about how much he loved you even though he couldn't show it the way he should have, then we'd like to try. And if we don't want that, then we'll respect your decision, Danica said, speaking for the first time since the call began. But Rebecca, I want you to know that your father spent 40 years trying to become worthy of the children he left behind. He may have failed you as a young man, but he never stopped being your father in his heart. The silence stretched so long that Emma checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, Rebecca spoke. I need to talk to Joshua. This is a lot to process. Can I call you back? Of course. Take all the time you need. Quote. Rebecca's laugh held genuine warmth. He's like your father was in the photos, serious, responsible, a little too focused on fixing everyone else's problems. He works with veterans who are struggling with PTSD and addiction. He says he's drawn to people who've made mistakes and are trying to find their way back. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Rebecca, Danica said carefully, before we go any further, I want you to know that if this becomes too difficult, if bringing us into your life causes problems for you or Joshua, we'll step back. We don't want to disrupt the peace you've built. That's exactly what he used to write in his letters, Rebecca said softly, always giving us permission to say no, to walk away, to choose our own comfort over his need for connection. He was trying to respect your boundaries, Sarah observed. I know, but it also meant we never had to confront the complexity of forgiveness. It was easier to leave him in the past than to figure out how to fit him into our present. Emma leaned forward. And now? Now he's gone. And we can't ask him the questions we should have asked years ago, but maybe we can ask them to you. Over the next hour, Rebecca shared pieces of her life that Bob had never known. Her marriage to David, a high school teacher. Her children, Sophie and Marcus, named, she admitted, after the father she'd never stopped wondering about. Her career as a pediatric nurse. Her struggles with anxiety that she now recognized might have been inherited from the father who'd fled when overwhelmed. She asked questions too. What was Bob like as a grandfather? Did he ever talk about them? How did he die? Was he happy? He was happy. Danica answered that last question. But he carried sadness too. He never forgave himself for leaving you. Every Father's Day, every birthday, every Christmas, he would get quiet and withdrawn, and I knew he was thinking about you. Did you ever suggest he try to contact us directly? The question hung in the air. Danica felt the weight of her family's attention, understanding that her answer would reveal her own role in keeping the families separated. No, she admitted. I was afraid that if he reached out and you rejected him, it would destroy him. I thought I was protecting him, but I see now that I might have been protecting myself too. From what? From the possibility that you and Joshua might be the children he really wanted. That we might be the consolation prize. Sarah made a sharp sound of disagreement. Mom, that's... No, Sarah. Let me say this. I was threatened by you before I ever met you. 2 children, who had his eyes, his temperament, who came from the love he'd felt before he met me. I was jealous of ghosts. The honesty was stark, raw in a way that family conversations rarely allowed. You weren't ghosts to us, Rebecca said quietly. In his letters, you were the family we could never be part of. The wife who understood him. The children who got to know him as the man he became instead of the boy who ran away. Tyler, who had been sketching throughout the conversation, held up his latest drawing, two families on opposite sides of a river, with bridges being built from both directions. Maybe, he said with the clarity that sometimes came from 19-year-old hearts, you were both afraid of the same thing, that there wasn't enough love to go around. But love isn't like money. It doesn't get smaller when you share it. The observation settled over the room like a benediction. Jennifer reached for Mike's hand. Carol smiled from her corner chair. Emma closed her laptop, finally setting aside her need to document every detail. Joshua wants to talk tomorrow night, Rebecca said. He's nervous, but he wants to hear about our father's life here. And he wants to tell you about his work with veterans. He thinks Dad would have understood the men he helps. People trying to come back from mistakes they can't undo. As they prepared to end the call, Rebecca asked one final question. When you think about him now, after everything you've learned, how do you remember him? The family looked at each other, 40 years of memories reframing themselves in light of new understanding. As someone who loved him perfectly but completely, Danica said finally. As someone who spent most of his life trying to be worthy of the love he'd been given and the love he'd lost. That sounds about right, Rebecca agreed. Maybe someday we can all remember him together. After the call ended, the family sat in comfortable silence, processing the conversation and the possibility it represented. They were no longer protecting a secret or hiding from painful truths. They were simply a family, complex and imperfect, learning how to love across distance and time, and the complications that make families both heartbreaking and beautiful. After the call ended, the family sat in comfortable silence, processing the conversation and the possibility it represented. They were no longer protecting a secret or hiding from painful truths. They were simply a family, complex and imperfect, learning how to love across distance and time, and the complications that make families both heartbreaking and beautiful. The conversation with Joshua that evening proved to be both easier and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Where Rebecca's voice carried warmth and curiosity, Joshua's held the careful control of someone who'd spent years helping others heal from trauma while wrestling with his own unresolved pain. I want you to know, he said after the initial introductions, that I'm not looking for a father figure. I had a good stepfather. I had male mentors in the military. I don't need Marcus Kellerman to complete some missing piece of my identity. His directness reminded everyone sharply of Sarah, and Mike found himself smiling, despite the tension in Joshua's voice. We're not trying to replace anything you've built, Mike replied. We're just trying to understand the man who raised us and figure out how to honor all the parts of his story. The man who abandoned us, you mean? The man who made a terrible mistake when he was young and spent 40 years trying to live with it, Tyler said quietly, his artistic sensitivity picking up on the pain beneath Joshua's defensive anger. A long pause. When Joshua spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. Rebecca says you found letters he wrote to us but never sent? Boxes of them, Emma confirmed. Letters tracking your entire lives. He knew about your deployment to Afghanistan, your work with veterans, your engagement to Sarah. He was so proud of your service. He knew about my service? He kept newspaper clippings, Danica said gently. Articles about your unit, your medals, your work with PTSD programs. He told me once that he thought you'd become the kind of man he'd always wanted to be, someone who ran toward people in trouble instead of away from them. The silence stretched long enough that they wondered if Joshua had ended the call. Finally, his voice came through, rougher now. I work with a lot of guys who walked away from their families when they couldn't handle the pressure. Combat veterans, addiction survivors, men who made choices they can't unmake. I tell them that recovery means living with the consequences of your actions while still trying to do better. That sounds like something our father would have understood, Sarah observed. Yeah, it does. Joshua cleared his throat. Look, I'm not ready for family dinners and holiday cards. But I am curious about something. Rebecca says you're all processing learning about us, just like we're processing learning about you. What's that been like? Mike fielded the question, his insurance adjuster's mind finding clarity in the complexity. Disorienting. Humbling. We thought we knew our father's story, But it turns out we only knew half of it, the half where he'd learned how to stay and fight instead of running away. And now we understand that people can be both things. The person who makes terrible mistakes, and the person who spends their life trying to make amends. It doesn't excuse what he did to you and Rebecca, but it helps us understand that love isn't always simple or clean. Jennifer leaned toward the phone. Joshua, can I ask you something? What would you want from us, if anything? What would feel right to you? I don't know yet, Joshua admitted. Maybe just knowing that he thought about us. That we mattered to him, even after he left. Rebecca wants to exchange photos, maybe letters. She's always been more forgiving than me. And what would forgiveness look like for you? Pastor David asked. He'd joined them for this conversation at the family's request, understanding that Joshua might need to hear from someone who'd known Bob in his role as father and community member. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, Joshua said slowly. Maybe understanding. Maybe just accepting that people are complicated and that you can love someone and be angry with them at the same time. Tyler held up another sketch, this one showing a bridge with people standing on both sides, some stepping forward, others hanging back, all at their own pace. That makes sense, Tyler said. Maybe we don't all have to want the same kind of relationship. Maybe it's okay if Rebecca wants one thing and you want something different. And what do you want? Joshua asked Tyler directly. I want to know about my brother and sister, Tyler said simply. I want to understand how Grandpa's love worked across distance and time, and I want to paint a family portrait someday that includes all of us, even if we're scattered across the country. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical questions about Bob's death, his funeral, his final years. Joshua asked about his health, his hobbies, his relationship with his grandchildren. He wanted to know if Bob had been happy, if he'd found peace, if he'd ever talked about regret. He talked about you all the time, Carol said, speaking for the first time during the call. I'm Carol, Danica's friend. I knew your father for 25 years, and not a holiday passed that he didn't wonder what you were doing, whether you were safe, whether you'd found happiness. He never tried to contact us directly after the early years, Joshua pointed out. Because Rebecca's brother threatened legal action if he continued, Danica explained. And because he was terrified that reaching out would hurt you more than helping you, he decided that loving you meant leaving you alone. Even though it was killing him, Carol added. As the call wound down, Joshua made an unexpected request. Would it be possible? Could someone send me copies of some of those letters he wrote? Not all of them. Just maybe one or two. I think I need to hear his voice saying the things he never got to say. Emma promised to scan and email several letters, choosing ones that showed Bob's pride in Joshua's military service and his work with veterans. They exchanged contact information, made tentative plans for Rebecca to visit Denver sometime in the fall, talked about the possibility of a video call that would include both siblings. But it was Joshua's final comment that lingered after the call ended. You know what's strange? For 40 years I thought he left because we weren't enough. Now I'm learning that maybe he left because he thought he wasn't enough. I don't know which is sadder. After everyone had finally gone to bed, Danica sat alone in Bob's study, surrounded by the evidence of his dual life, photos of both families, letters to children he couldn't reach, documents tracking lives he'd chosen to observe from a distance. For the first time since his death, she felt his presence in the room not as grief or loss, but as peace. The secret that had defined their marriage was finally free to become a bridge instead of a barrier. On her phone, she had Rebecca's contact information. In her email, she had Joshua's address. Tomorrow, Emma would send those precious letters across time and distance, carrying a father's love to children who'd never stopped wondering if they mattered to him. The annual Samson family reunion was over, but something new had begun. Not a perfect family. They'd never be that. But an honest one. A family that could hold complexity and contradiction, love and loss, forgiveness and frustration all at the same time. As Danica finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, she realized that Bob's greatest gift hadn't been the secret he'd asked her to keep, but the truth he'd left her free to share. In protecting his story, she'd learned the difference between love that hides and love that reveals, between loyalty that isolates and loyalty that connects. Outside her window, Denver stretched toward the mountains under a clear night sky. And somewhere in Cincinnati and Portland, two people were reading 40-year-old letters from a father they'd never really known, finally hearing the words he'd never found the courage to speak: that love could survive abandonment, that families could be rebuilt even after being broken, and that sometimes the longest journey home was the one that took you back to yourself. The whispers were finally over. The real conversation had just begun. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.